So, in his book, Let Your Life Speak, Parker Palmer shares a story from his own life when he was being offered the opportunity to be a president of a small liberal arts college. Not only did Palmer think this is my dream job, but his professional colleagues also concurred. This really does align well with your gifts. It's a great job for you. So Palmer went to visit the campus and he met with the faculty, the students, the administrators, and the trustees. And the visit went well, so well, in fact, that he was told before he left that he would probably receive a call in the very near future extending him the job. But on his drive home, something didn't sit with him. He wasn't sure that this was, in fact, the right job at the right time for him. And so, being a good, faithful Quaker, he drew upon his tradition and decided to call together a clearness committee, which is part of the Quaker tradition developed over the last 300 years, where you bring some trusted listeners into a room with you as you are working through a question, a query, some decision or opportunity. And this group sits with you silently and asks you questions, hoping that through this process you will listen a little bit more closely to your inner teacher, that voice of wisdom that we all have within us. See, the Quakers understand that there's a lot of noise in most of our lives, and some of that noise comes from the outside, but a lot of it comes from the inside. And so the goal in this clearness committee is not to come from the outside in to try to change someone, but to refrain from trying to fix or save or advise, but to help the person discover the answer from the inside out. So after a few routine questions in this clearness committee, somebody asked him, "Parker, what would you like most about being the president of this college?" And Palmer answered, "Well, I wouldn't like giving up my writing, and I wouldn't like giving up my teaching, and I don't like the politics of colleges and universities, and I wouldn't like never knowing who my friends are, and I wouldn't like having to glad hand people that I don't respect who may happen to have a lot of money." And finally, the questioner interrupted him and said, "Parker, let me remind you what the question was. The question is what you would like most about being president of the college." And so Palmer felt compelled to give an honest answer, but he found himself appalled at what came out of his mouth. He said, "Well, I guess what I'd like most is to get my picture in the paper with the word president underneath it." Palmer writes that although his answer was laughable, nobody was laughing. In fact, what they did was hold the space. And there was this long, uncomfortable silence until the questioner said, "Parker, can you think of an easier way to get your picture in the paper?" And then the room burst out laughing. And they concluded their work, and by the next morning, Palmer had called up the college and said, "I'm going to withdraw my name from consideration." Today we conclude a 2-week sermon series on humility based on my favorite definition of humility, which is this: humility is being who you are, no more and no less. Humility, as I said last week, is the central Christian virtue. I think it is the number one virtue. Mary Margaret Funk said of humility, it is for the Christian what enlightenment is for the Buddhist, and what realization is for the Hindu, or what sincerity is for the Confucian, or righteousness is for the Jew, or surrender is for the Muslim, or annihilation is for the Sufi. And this becomes clear, I think, when we look at what Jesus taught and how he lived his life, including this text that we read today. Jesus enters this home of a religious fancy person, somebody who the society has given and bestowed upon all this respect and attention. And so this man is demonstrating some attention to Jesus, inviting him in his home, and the Pharisees are there and they're watching Jesus, but he's also watching them. And this is what he observes, and he has the guts to share with them his observation. He says, "You know what? I noticed that you're concerned with getting the best seats at the table. And I noticed that you want to be noticed. You seem to want to be respected." And so he tells them this parable, which on the surface seems like just basic table etiquette, but is actually an assault on their pride. And here's, I think, what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if you happen to be noticed by others for whatever reason, pay that forward by noticing the people that others don't notice. Or, if you are respected by others for whatever reason, show the same respect to the people who others may not respect in the same way that they respect you. Or, if you've gained power or privilege or prestige for whatever reason, use that power, use that privilege, use that prestige to empower somebody who may not have gained those things the way that you have. For humility is being no more than who you are. A few years ago, there was an interview of two police officers whose first, month on the job was at the Civil Rights March in Washington in 1963. One was a white officer, Martin Nerveth, and the other was a black officer, Joseph Burden. And despite the fact that this was just 3 months after Bull Connor turned the hose and the attack dogs on the peaceful protesters down in Birmingham, Alabama, this was the most peaceful demonstration that they had ever seen or heard about. But Nerveth's life was changed because for the first time he realized that as a white man, he had this privilege his whole life, and he was humbled when he began to see for the first time clearly that there was a whole segment of the population that did not have the same rights and privileges as he did, including his brother, Officer Burden. He realized that all his life he had been encouraged to be strong and privileged, but he hadn't been encouraged to be humble. And he looked at his fellow officer and he realized all his life he's been encouraged to be humble, but not strong and privileged. Last week, I preached a sermon geared towards the officer burdens of the world, that people who need to hear that you are no less than who God has called you to be, and playing small is not going to serve you well, and it's not living a humble life. But today I want to turn to the officer Nerveths of the world, people who need to be reminded, like myself, that we are no more than anybody else. People who need to be challenged sometimes to remember that for ourselves. For everyone is equal in God's eyes, created as beloved children of God. As Christians, this should be right at the heart of what we're about, because this is so clear in the way that Jesus demonstrates and the way he lives out his life, as Paul articulates so beautifully in the words that we're going to say together later. He says, Jesus, although he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, becoming human as we are. Not Superman, not superhuman, superhuman. Or as our tradition teaches us, fully human. It's no coincidence the word human and humility sound similar because they have the same root, the Latin word humus, which means earth or soil. To be human, to be humble, is to live close to the ground, to be of the earth, and to never forget that we are of the earth. And so for those of us who've been given rights and privileges beyond the way others have, our job is to come back to earth, to ground ourselves again in the deeper truth of our kinship with all people and all creation. Our journey is to remember that we are just like everybody else, no less and no more. Or as Martin Luther liked to say, we are all saints and sinners, all of us. We are of earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, and the breath of God moves through every single one of us. We are that mystery held together. The story goes there was a very proud and famous samurai warrior who came to visit a Zen master. And when he came into the place where the Zen master lived, he looked at the beauty of the Zen master and the grace of that moment, and he suddenly felt inferior. And he wondered, why am I feeling inferior? And he asked the Zen master, he said, why is it that the moment I entered into this space and came into your presence, I began to feel inferior? I've never felt that way before. I have faced death many times, and I've never felt any fear. Why now? So the master said, when everybody is gone, I will answer. So people continued to come throughout the day to come and visit with the Zen master, and the samurai was getting more and more tired and more annoyed, waiting for his opportunity to get the answer that he longed for. And finally, when the room was empty, the samurai said, can you answer me now? And the master said, let's go outside. It was a full moon night. The moon was just there above the horizon. And the Zen master said, look at these trees. This tree is high in the sky, and this one is small right beside it. They both have existed outside my window for many years, and there has never been a problem, not once. The smaller tree has never said to the bigger tree, why do you feel inferior to me? And the bigger tree doesn't ask a similar question. This tree is small, that tree is big. Why have I never heard a whisper of it? He asked the samurai. And the samurai said, because they can't compare. And the Zen master looked at him and said, then you don't need to ask me any more questions. You have your answer. The late John Stott said that pride is our greatest enemy, and humility is our greatest friend. And if that sounds like hyperbole, that's exactly what St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, even C.S. Lewis, they said the same thing. C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind, and it is pride, which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Those of us who struggle with pride know how insidious it can be. And our journey is to come back to earth, to live in deeper communion with all people, to believe that it is the greatest illusion to think that somehow we've arisen above anyone else. And how crazy it is to give rights and privileges to some and not to all. And here's the great mystery I think we forget about humility. Living into genuine humility doesn't make us any weaker. It makes us so much stronger, so much more able to face adversity, so much more able to be resilient in the face of adversity, so much more able to stay grounded in our humanity and in a power greater than ourselves that is available to everyone, but only accessible through humility and being the human being that God has created us to be. Forgive me, another Zen Buddhist story about a band of samurai who are riding through the countryside causing destruction and terror, and they approach a monastery, and all the monks in the monastery scatter when they see these samurai coming, except for one, the abbot, an old, humble man who has accepted his humanity, has faced his mortality, and is no longer afraid of death. When the samurai enters the monastery, everybody has scattered except the abbot, who is sitting there in the lotus position, meditating. Angered at what he sees, the samurai leader draws his sword and snarls, "Don't you see that I am the sort of man who can run through you without batting an eye?" To which the abbot says, "Don't you see that I'm the kind of man who can be run through without batting an eye?" The false power of pride meets the real power of humility. A human being who is no more than who they really are. Someone who no longer is attached to being noticed or having respect or privilege or power or prestige, but someone who can look deeply into any situation, even a situation that can cause harm to them professionally and can even take their life, and say, "Don't you see that I am a person who can be utterly forgotten without batting an eye?" Humility may be a strange friend, but it also may be our greatest friend. So, as fellow children of God, as followers of Jesus, whose way is so radically clear, let us learn to be humble, to be who we are, no more and no less.